to our today's speaker. We're very happy that Dr. Karen Lucas has joined us today. Karen is a Professor of Human Geography and a Director of Research in the Department of Geography within the School of Environment, Education and Development at the University of Manchester, where she leads the Transport and Mobilities Research theme for the Manchester Urban Institute. She has many years' experience of delivering social research into practice in transport, employing a variety of mixed methods approaches to issues of mobility, accessibility and social justice. And Karen and I actually worked together on a project about 10 years ago now, I think, which was looking at the social impacts of transport. So I'll hand over to you now, Karen, to tell us about transport-related social exclusion.
So I'm trying to work out
up north.
Is this the right way to be facing?
Yeah, it's fine.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm going to stand.
Yeah, so that over there will be filming.
Okay. Is that all right? Like masking anything?
No.
Is that okay?
That's fine. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I sort of rather naughtily named this transport social exclusion. It's grim up north, and that's largely because I'm based in Manchester University and Manchester Urban Institute, and so obviously that's like a good focus for our work to be locally in context. And as Laura said, about 10 years ago, not long after the Social Exclusion Unit had produced their report on transport-related social exclusion, we did a seminar series and we did some workshops into practice, and we did a special issue on transport and on transport and social issues in transport, something like that. And the LSE contributed one on neighbourhood issues, I remember. But it's quite so maybe look out for that, because that's better that you'll take us back. And so this is like a little bit for me historical thing, because when all the time you yourself, you did all the work on social exclusion, there really wasn't a transport dimension to it. And the Social Exclusion Unit and the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit, no, they had all these pacts, but they didn't have transport. And I guess that's because until people needed to get going, they didn't realise that they couldn't get going because there wasn't any transport. Do you know what I mean? So these isolated neighbourhoods and low income and worst estates were very, they didn't have cars, but they were poor public transport links, and they were often about 6 to 10 miles outside of where they needed to go for the same main employment centres, but it didn't become apparent. So then the Transport and Social Exclusion report followed up, and in a way we benefited because we knew exactly what was going on in terms of transport-related social exclusion, not necessarily always the same as social exclusion. But by the time we got into gear and we got the Department for Transport up and running to recognise there was a transport-related social exclusion issue and to put some funding towards it, austerity hit. So we get all the cutbacks in local transport spending. And for example, Mersey Travel, who I was working with at the time, lost 80% of its budget. And most of it was going towards local buses and special community transport and all these things. So it's not that we didn't know how to do it. We didn't know that it wasn't a problem. It was just that there wasn't any spending to address it. And I mean, I guess you could say that for all of the sectors. And as a consequence, I think that it would be fair to say that social exclusion has never really been properly addressed through the policy, different policy departments, because the Social Exclusion Unit had all of those different targets, didn't it, and indicators and ownership of those indicators, and really that went to pot, not just for transport, but across the board. And then as a consequence, what I ended up doing was spending a lot of time going to other countries and doing transport-related social exclusion in other countries like Australia and Canada, the US, and then belatedly in developing countries where it really took off and had a big sort of impact. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about the stuff that's going on more recently, which is a bit more hopeful in the Northern local authority, transport authorities. So, oh, no, it's working again now.
Right then.
So anyone who's ever read my work probably recognises this diagram. And the intention of the diagram, which I'm not going to go into in any great detail, was to try and show that there's a difference between social disadvantage and transport disadvantage. And it's only when it intersects in the middle to cause transport poverty, i.e. you've got no money and you've got no transport, that you start getting into this whole thing of inaccessibility, not only to goods and services, but also to life enhancing opportunities and social networks and everything else, which leads to social exclusion, so transport-related social exclusion, which then has a feedback effect, which means that you get even less transport resources and even less because it goes on in a circular way, much in the same way as those circular diagrams of the early days of reinforcement of social exclusion through the policy that were done elsewhere. But if you get your social norms and practices and your economic and political structures and your governance frameworks right, then actually you can not completely, but prevent a lot of this going on. But you have to be clear about which section you're working in. So just because you suddenly tackle transport disadvantage, i.e. by putting the bus on, does not necessarily mean that people on low skills will be getting to work and taking up employment, right? It's like, but there's this sort of idiocy within policy that A leads to B leads to C directly. And there's a misunderstanding, I think, particularly within the transport arena, just how much transport can really do about addressing social exclusion. So that's a sort of a bit of a background thing. I mean, I know that to lots of audiences, I think it comes to some surprise that there is even poverty in the UK. I mean, we all know here in this audience that it's there and it's pernicious and it's long-standing, and that large percentages of the population are affected by it. And if you think about it in transport terms, more than a quarter of households don't have access to a car, right? And this doesn't mean that they live in London next to a railway station, next to a tube. It means that across the board, if you look at low-income areas, in fact, often urban areas, even more so, peripheral areas, 60% of households might not have, low-income households might not have access to a car. And certainly, if you add in all the people who can't drive, so not only do they not have access to a car, or maybe one car in their household, but they can't drive themselves, then, you know, for example, 67% of all job seekers can't drive. I mean, that's quite a startling statistic, right? Which surprisingly then means that job seekers have poor access to employment. There's a lot of employment destinations, and you can do this with other types of activities. So it's not all about employment, social inclusion, it's also about health and education and so forth. And certain groups are more affected than others, and particularly with transport, there is a bigger rural dimension to transport-related social exclusion than maybe we might see in terms of other domains. So we spend quite a lot of time, and this is actually work that's going on at the moment, and I've accredited Tom Jarvis here because Transport for the North at the moment are doing a grand job of developing indicators for transport-related social exclusion, which blend vulnerability in terms of income and other vulnerabilities, age and so forth, with accessibility. And for the whole of England have looked at the sort of incidences of transport-related social exclusion for the whole of the country, or the whole of England. And you'll see that the Northeast is particularly, so the black is vulnerability, is particularly vulnerable and also has quite high accessibility problems. It's not as bad as the Southwest, but the Northeast is also densely populated. And so we've got this issue that it's not necessarily to do with lack of density, just to do with bad transport. And we can see this in all the rail issues. So a big thing for Transport for the North is that they are basically running a whole programme around the levelling up agenda, which has got a big transport element to it. Now, whether they're spending the right money on the right things, like Northern Powerhouse Rail, when actually maybe what's really needed is community transport. You know, this is this thing about, oh, we'll up the transport accessibility and we'll assume that that will have a knockdown effect for levelling up. It might, in terms of the economic levelling up of the country, you know, north to south, direct links, getting more economy. But if it's more economy of the same thing, high-level jobs, tech industries and so forth, won't necessarily reduce social exclusion. So it's trying to unpack those two different dimensions. And I won't talk about all of this, but again, there's a whole report from Transport of the North on transport-related social exclusion that came out last September, I think, and it's a really good read if anyone's interested in this. They got it right. But it's not only about public transport. So I just said, like, lots of low-income households don't have a car, but nevertheless, lots of low-income households do have a car. And particularly at the moment, in terms of economic austerity and the increased fuel prices and so forth, and the hikes that have been in petrol prices over the last few months is coming down again now. But we're seeing a lot of these populations that have, so this represents people that don't spend much on transport, their personal transport, i.e. they don't have a car. And they don't travel very much, so they're immobile. They're very, very immobile, which is a problem for social exclusion, right? Because you don't want that sort of social isolation. But this here represents where it's very low income households, but there's like high levels of spending. And we reckon about 9% of the population, based on research that I did with Giulio Mattioli on the Living Cost of Food survey, it's a little bit out of date, but we reckon about 9% of the population are spending a disproportionate amount of money on running their cars. And that's largely because they have no transport alternatives. And if they want to be socially included, as in, and it's noticeable that there's certain groups like low parent families and a lot of low income employed part-timers, they have cars. And so they're putting this out and they go into debt as a result of this because basically they can't afford it. The other thing that we've been doing is lots and lots of this sort of regionally, locally based accessibility mapping. And again, this is work that we do with Giulio Mattioli and Ian Phillips while I was at Leeds. And here we're showing that, okay, we know that, so this is a combination of expenditure on fuel, income levels, and ability to walk and access public transport to key services, so that employment, healthcare, and so forth. And it's a composite indicator, which obviously needs unpacking, and which the authors do in this paper. But the broad picture is that you can see that although we know that Greater London has got all sorts of issues around social exclusion and poverty, doesn't have a big problem with transport-related social exclusion, and there's no mistake why. And it isn't just because of the metro, but also because London Transport runs a whole load of sort of peripheral services like community transport and does lots of cross-subsidy between those services that are socially destined. So you've still got bits of places, you know, around the outskirts of London and in some places that you wouldn't expect it, where they could be doing better. But when you've got an overall picture like that, it's much easier to target those places and to do something. When what you've got is like you have in West Yorkshire, where you've got like all of this problem, even right up into the centre of Leeds, which is right up here, you've got problems with walkability and accessibility. Bradford, the whole of Bradford, I mean, you know, has not got a decent public transport system. And therefore, you've got much more to do in those areas, basically. So it's not to say, oh, this is, you know, this is great, this is terrible, but it's like when you've got a base which requires so much, it's difficult to know where to target your funding. And looking back again to this accessibility, vulnerability risk, when we, I'm in Manchester, so obviously we were trying to work with Transport for Greater Manchester to do stuff on this. We could see that although Greater Manchester is not high up on the hit list in terms of the districts, the metropolitan areas for the north, in fact, in each of the local authority areas, apart from pretty much not the centre of Manchester. So look, the centre of Manchester, lots and lots and lots of transport interventions have gone on. But almost all, and even around the centre of all of the others, have got a problem. Not sure why Bolton, there's just one little area in Bolton. Bolton seems to be quite connected. And this also takes attention to connectivity to the next area. Do you know what I mean? So it's not just looking into Manchester all of the time. So it's thinking maybe this part of Wigan is because it's actually very well connected in the other direction. So but it's interesting to see there's significant places. And so like when we break it down by district to district, we could come down to, this is lower super output area. So it's pretty good. Come down to about 1,000 households in the areas where we're talking about, and we can start to look at what's going wrong. And that's sort of where we're getting at. Can't do anything about the vulnerability issue. Poverty is going on all over the place. But is it right that Northern Rail will do something about this? You know, all that spending, or is it actually that might level up the economy, but it might not ever level up the social aspiration, the social ability to get to jobs and take advantage. So you can start to really look at what's going on. And we're trying now to get a programme together with Transport for the North and Greater Manchester, where we can actually really interrogate these locations and start to see what's going on in them and what the dimension is. Because if Northern Rail, for example, is designed to take people from Huddersfield to the centre of Manchester for work, maybe lots of people in these areas might be retired and don't even need to go to work. You know, that might not be their primary, you know, they might, maybe you can't get from the nursery to the school, or maybe the kids can't get to the college, you know, so it's like, it may not necessarily be anything to do with these mainline rail networks. And I've been working with Sarah Marie Hall recently, and this is very much her research, not my own. And you'll notice that I have not been presenting much of my own research in this area, and it's because I've been mostly not doing research in the UK. And I thought that this was more interesting. And her work is on economic austerity and very qualitative. So it mixes well, I think, with the sort of more analytical metrics type thing that's going on. And she sort of talks about why it matters, you know, why does it matter to people? And does extraordinary research with different groups of different individuals who are experiencing issues of poverty and economic austerity, and gets them to talk about what that feels like for them. And obviously, anyone who's worked with social exclusion and socially excluded populations before knows that it isn't just this thing of, I can't get the job, I can't do this, but actually the fact that you feel completely disempowered and disconnected and hopeless and helpless, and it's awful, and that you lose your support networks and many things. And so, and we're talking about economic crisis, but it's not a crisis, it's a scandal. It's been going on and on and on since 2008. We've not had any let up, and it's just got worse for the people that have experienced it for all of that time. So, you know, it's not a crisis. It's not, it makes out that it's just one-offs, but it isn't. It's continuous for people that are living in poverty. And we particularly looked at Sarah's work and reanalyzed it from the perspective of what people were saying about transport in the context. This research was undertaken before COVID, so not even taking account of all this stuff. And people are talking about they can't get a bus pass because they've now got to move to a different school, and they've got to buy a new and it's just like their educational choices are reduced because basically they haven't got transport. They can't get to the school that they want. There's no choice at all in it. And, you know, all of this is because they can't get a bus pass. So, you know, should we, I mean, because it's no good giving kids a free bus pass if the parents can't get the free bus pass to escort them, right? It's like, it's just a ridiculous thing. So it's all very well that the child can travel free, but if you've got no money, how do you escort your children to school? And then the sort of family burdens, you know, it's like spending quite a lot of money, £20 every week, just buying bus passes. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? When you're on a basic wage. So I know you guys probably all know about this. And so that whole thing about, you know, it's impossible to segregate transport poverty from actual poverty. So we're recognising housing poverty, we're recognising energy poverty, I mean, it's all poverty. What we need to address is the poverty, right? But for as long as we're not doing that, and we've got welfare policies that don't do that and keep people below the breadline, we then have to think about, well, how can we subsidise this with other things, and thinking about how we give bus passes. And Greater Manchester has got a really good bus pass policy. It's just reduced its flat fare bus trips to £2 a trip, which is as far as you can go. But that's still £4 two ways, and that's still 20. But you know, it's like, it's still expensive, right? And it means that people's lives, like that woman when she was talking about the school trip, it means that they really have to change their whole lives. So Sarah was, she had me practically in tears when she was talking about this, and she talked about a woman who basically, she was walking and talking with her, and it was pouring with rain, and she was going to collect her social security from the post office, and she didn't have proper shoes on, and she didn't have a coat. And Sarah was there with like a big Mac on and, you know, proper boots and everything. And this woman was walking and slushing around, and her shoes were soaking wet, and she was soaking wet through, and she had to do that there and back because she couldn't get the bus, you know. And it's like, you don't think about that. And the fact that all of that time that you'll spend walking and getting freezing cold and wearing yourself out means you spend less time with your kids, but you spend less time on doing anything for yourself, right? So it's really pernicious on your lifestyle as well. So thinking about this cost of living, she was sort of saying we've got inadequate. So it's not just about this cost. That was the other thing that we got. So when you go back to those maps, cost isn't the only issue. The absence of transport. So even if you gave people free travel, you would actually still have a problem because they can't physically get there. And there's this idea that, you know, everything can be done by public transport. There's insufficient intelligence around the fact that people could be using shared taxis, that there's all sorts of other options out there, that it might be about improving walking facilities so that people feel safe to walk to where they go. You know, many different other things. And also it's a massive thing about land uses. So in lots and lots of places, and where I live in Partington in Manchester, which is out in Trafford, has just got a levelling up grant. And it's an area where they're building like loads and loads of new social housing. But the nearest train station is 5 miles away. And the buses run once an hour to that train station. You know, it's like, so realistically, you've got to have the motivation to get yourself to that train station, the money to get yourself to that train station in order to link with the jobs that would be, because Partington itself has no jobs, just housing. And you see low income and a manifestation of this, like you see these really low income housing estates that are obviously housing cooperation built, housing association built, with just like 4 cars in front of them, because that is literally the only way you can get to the shops, you can get to the school, you can get. So everyone has some, and they're not good cars, they're beat up old cars. So it's got a knock-on effect for the local authorities' net zero policies. You know, it just goes on and on. So it isn't all, it's like, let's look at the root cause of what's happening here and maybe address not so much that, but the joined up land use planning and service planning sector as well. Oh, sorry, going backwards instead of forwards. So we were sort of like, so what we've been doing is running these workshops. We've got a transport and austerity working group, and it's got the local authorities, Greater Manchester, TFN involved in it, but it's also got the food banks and the advocacy groups for like older people and young people and so forth, and trying more and more to try and get people in the room, like the levelling up people. I can never remember what it's called now. What was DCLG, but is now something and levelling up, and various other people in the room at high level to try and sort of work through what these issues are and to build this idea of building transport, poverty into transport strategies, so that we investigate them to see what contribution they're really making to reducing transport-related social exclusion, but equally seeing transport in another domain within the poverty domain. So we're working with Greater Manchester Poverty Alliance to try and build on their existing poverty calculator and to put a transport domain in it, because it's not there already. So we think it's this interaction. And it's also because, and I don't know whether this happens in other areas of social exclusion, but at the moment what tends to happen for transport is that everything is segregated either by mode. So like there's the cycling and walking lobby, there's the bus lobby, there's the rail lobby, there's the car lobby. So it's split that way. And then what you can and can't do. Oh, so you've got transport injustice because you haven't got a cycle route within 500 meters of your doorstep. You know, that means you're socially excluded. Not necessarily, right? You know what I mean? Not saying it's not part of the solution, but it's certainly not. And I'm so fed up with people saying to me, oh, bicycles are free and they're cheap and it gives you free transport. Everyone should cycle. And it's like I've taken a look at the profile of socially excluded people and seen that that's just not the case. But it's maybe part of the solution for some people, but certainly not a panacea. But equally, the bus lobby is just as bad. Buses are everything, you know, it's a mix. And then also what happens is that you've got the lobby groups that are like older people, younger people, children, lone parent, So that's all split as well. So it's like what we're trying to do is get the people all together in the room and look at the commonalities between transport-related social exclusion across those groups and look at the solutions across those modes. So, you know, that's the idea. And I think what we're doing from research into action is like trying, so this engagement process, because you have to have this local capacity. They don't talk to each other, not only the policymakers, but the lobby groups and the campaign groups, because they're so busy doing what they do, their mainstream thing, they don't connect. And so we're trying to provide a place where they can make that connection and talk to each other. And the willingness is so there, but obviously everyone's overburdened. But it's great. We're seeing the stakeholders across these different domains and across these different modes to be really coming together. And we've got to produce this evidence base. So I think it really matters that we measure things and we show. And we also show not only what the problem is, but how solutions can affect those problems and really evaluate what we're doing in terms of different initiatives. And that's a bit what we did, didn't we, when we were doing before. It's like, it's not like we don't know how to do it, but some of the mainstream ways that are being done, I wonder how much those indicators, for example, in TFM would really change if what you did was introduce a local minibus. I don't think they change much because they're all ranked scores and they're not really actually looking closely enough at the sort of micro solutions, which are difficult to measure. So you might need a lot more qualitative research to be able to do that stuff. And then what we're trying to do is produce after this a sort of agenda for change, which includes local communities themselves who can have a say about what they think the solutions are, because they really probably know that it's just that bus doesn't connect with that railway station. You know, it might be lots and lots of micro things that really make a difference. And thinking about coming up with some sort of like social measures of the outcomes, which is a big bit that I've been doing on social metrics, to sort of try and see how we can gauge how different transport interventions affect the poverty and social exclusion, and how different bits of the transport can work to do that. So I think that's probably, and what we keep saying to people is that there's much bigger consequences for transport-related social exclusion. The way that we run our transport systems at the moment, it's like I haven't even begun to talk about. We talked a lot about accessibility, but the whole issue around safety and children's safety, but everybody's safety, pedestrian safety, the way that we have this car-dominated. I know it feels different, doesn't it, in London? It doesn't feel so bad, but you know, we have this very car-dominated society, which makes it difficult for everyone to go around. The whole stuff about net zero and all the stuff about, you know, pollution and health and asthma and traumas, big levels of asthma in children alongside roads and so forth. Another form of transport-related social exclusion, because we have these sort of like very bad mixes. Congestion, this is in the global south, it's not ever quite the same here, but you know, nevertheless, congestion, if people didn't have to drive their cars because they had better accessibility through local neighborhoods to services and better public transport links or other solutions, collective solutions, then we probably could reduce congestion. Parking, don't get me started. Inappropriate parking, disabilities rights, all of this human rights stuff around space. I mean, it's just awful. Social isolation in old age, that inaccessible group that I talked to you about, that 11% that don't spend anything on their mobility. That's not good. It's not great not to be mobile at all, right? And then climate change, flooding, and all of the communities. So it's very interconnected with all of these other transport agendas, none of which measure the social dimension of those phenomena. So that's me. don't think I did too bad with the timing. And if there's any questions online or in the room, I'd be more than happy to take them. Then you can look my research up here. I hope that wasn't too rapid.
No, it's great. Thank you, Karen. Yeah, and that's a great basis for discussion, I think. Is anybody in the room? Yep. Abigail.